I'd like to put together a Spring Boot based microservice with a RESTful API that can be used in a single page interface web page and also deployed to Amazon Beanstalk. So how would I do that? Well, I've got the Spring Source tool suite shortcut on my desktop, so I'm going to double click on that. It will ask me for my workspace location, which I've set up as underscore workspace. I'll click launch and the tool will begin. Now, as that starts up, one thing I should mention is I'm going to be doing some testing on localhost 8080, and I actually have a program that conflicts with port 8080. If I go to administrative tools and then I look at services, you'll notice that I've got Jenkins running, and Jenkins runs on port 8080 on my machine, so I got to come over here and stop it. Now, you might not have Jenkins running, but you might have some other service running on port 8080, and if you do, stop it because it will cause a port conflict. So here is the workspace. Now, I should mention I have a little application called Rochambeau, rock, paper, scissors. There it is there. It's a nice little rock, paper, scissors game. And I want to keep track of the score, wins, losses, and ties. So I'm going to factor that out into a microservice. It's going to be a global wins, losses, and ties. Keeps track of wins, losses, and ties for everybody. And so how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to create a brand new project. So I'm going to create a new Spring Starter project. I'm going to call it Keeping Score. I'm actually going to use a WAR file as opposed to a jar file. Notice you can use a Kotlin or Groovy. I'm going to create a WAR file here. The group is going to be com.mcnz.rps.rest. And I'll make that the package name as well. You have Mavens there, not Gradle. That all looks good to me. I'm going to click the next button. And here I select what I want to use. Now I actually want Spring Web Services, but it's not visible. There should be a scroll bar in there. You got to open up the page, and boom, there you go. You get your scroll bar. And I want to use some of the technologies under Spring Web. You can maybe even click Spring Web Service, although Spring Web will bring me in the RESTful APIs. That's all I need. That's going to be more for SOAP. But no, I'll click it on there anyways. It's worth taking a look at what's available. A bunch of Spring tools here. Tools for SQL, tools for NoSQL, help with Microsoft Azure, good old GCP right there, the Google Cloud Platform. I actually want to select Spring Boot DevTools. That'll help me stop and start the application as I run. And notice, of course, the ubiquitous AWS and even Alibaba. All I really want is DevTools and Web. I threw Web Services in there as well. Click Next, nothing to see there. Click Finish, and that will start off the project. Now, when you do Java development, you want to model the real world. And in our application, we want to keep track of the score of a game. So we're going to create a class called score. We do need to wait for the project to have been configured. So you notice that right here it says, oh, we're just getting things set up. That'll just take a second. When it's done, there's usually a couple of problems here, just warnings, but annoying nevertheless. But I'm going to come over here, open up this folder. You'll see a couple of files already created. Keeping Score, that's just the boot harness for the application. Spring always puts that in. And then the servlet initializer is actually what happens if you select WAR file instead of jar. We're not going to work on either of those files, but it's just worth noting, taking a look at. I think I might even go into the preferences here and just increase the font in Java. This font's kind of small right here, so let's edit that and increase its size just a little bit. 16, apply, apply, and close. And there we go. That's just going to make things look a little bit nicer when I create this score class. So I'm going to right click on that package, create a brand new class. It's going to be called score. I'm not going to add anything else in there. And it's not actually going to be the best Java bean in the world. I'm going to be pretty lazy here. I'm not going to add any setters and getters. I'm just going to add a couple of public variables. So it'll keep track of wins, ties, and that's about it. Now those should be private and accessed only through public setters and getters. Maybe you should even make this serializable as well. But I'm just trying to keep things fairly simple here. So I'm going to leave it like that. No verboseness, no ceremony in these Java files. So with that created, the next step is to create the service which will mitigate access to this resource. So I'm again going to create a brand new class. I'll call this the score service. Again, no interfaces, no inheritance, just a simple Java class. And this particular Java class, it's going to keep track of the score. So I'm going to add an instance variable here. Actually, it's not going to be an instance variable. It's going to be a static variable. Those are the ones that stick to your clothes when you bring them out of the dryer. It's going to be called score. It's going to be of type score. And I'm going to initialize it to a new score. And so static actually doesn't stick to your clothes when you bring it out of the dryer. It sticks to the JVM. So there'll be one instance per JVM. The data type is score, the name is score, and I initialize a new one to avoid null pointer exceptions when my code runs. Now, if you want something to support REST, all you have to do is add a little REST controller annotation. Now notice I pronounced that with an uppercase R and an uppercase C. You might see a red X next to it. Now if you see a red X, you got to get your eyes checked because that's a white X on a red background. Now if you see a white X on a red background, that's to be expected because the REST controller is not available by default. You have to say, hey, I want to import that. So you right click on your white space, say source, organize imports, and the JVM will say, oh, I think I can find that class somewhere in the Spring libraries, and it'll import it in for you. So you can go organize imports, and momentarily you will see that a import has been added to the top of the class. Now I'm going to add an other here. Cross origin is also going to be needed. That's just going to make it possible for my web pages that aren't hosted at the same URL to invoke this web service. And again, I've got to do this whole organize imports thing that I miss. Yeah, there it is right there. So right click, organize imports, and that was a little faster that time. I think we got one more to bring in. It's going to be the get mapping, which we'll see right here. So this is supposed to be a RESTful API. People should be able to invoke these methods through a URL. One of the things they're going to want to do is just know what the score is. So I'm going to create a public method called getScore, which returns a score. Returns the score. It'll return it as JSON, although you don't have to code that. The tool will do it automatically. And I'll do it automatically if you add this annotation, get mapping score. Now again, I've got this issue with the white X on the red background. I have to right click, source, organize imports. There you go, the get mapping gets added up there. Now what this says is if somebody comes to my website, mcnz.com/score, this will return them in JSON format the score, which is essentially the number of wins, the number of ties, and the number of losses. Now I also want to give people the ability to increase the score. So if somebody increases the score, we'll increase the wins, I guess it would be. We'll increase the number of wins by 1, so we'll do increase wins, score.wins++, and then return the score again. If you increase the wins, some people probably want to increase the wins and then know what the new score is. And if somebody wants this, they'll go mcnz.com/increase wins. So I'll just copy that and paste that there. And it's not /score, it'll be /increase wins. Technically it probably should be /wins and done through a post mapping, but I'm not going to get too Rastafarian there. Sorry, not Rastafarian, Restafarian. That's what we call people that are religious about rest, a Restafarian. Okay, so that is the increase wins, get mapping. Now I probably want to do this for losses and ties, so do a little copy and paste there. And instead of increase wins on the second one, it'll be increase ties. So make the appropriate changes in all three places: the mapping, the name of the method, and the increment. And there we go. Now we have a nice RESTful web service that can tell you the score, the number, and help you increase the wins, ties, and losses in a rock, paper, scissors game. Now, and of course, it's this rock, paper, scissors game that I've got here that we want to add the score to. Let's just take a look at it again. There it is. We don't have the score happening yet. We want to be able to play this game and display the global score up top. Now let's test this out. Let's just go over to keeping score and say run as a Java application. No, not a Java application, a Spring Boot application. That's what we want. This will start up Tomcat. Again, port 8080. Make sure you got Jenkins stopped if Jenkins is installed, or anything else that runs on port 8080. This doesn't like my buffer settings, but I'm going to leave my buffer settings the way they are. It now says Tomcat started on port 8080, so I should be able to open up a browser and go to localhost 8080/score. And you notice it tells me the number of wins, ties, and losses. Looks like Firefox is formatting that. That's the raw data just in JSON. The tool just does that for you. And if I say increase wins, it'll increase the wins. I had to refresh a bunch of times. It's not a dempotent. Let's see if increase losses is working. Seems to be, and increase ties. Well, there we go. We've got a nice little application on our hands. Now, I'd like to actually deploy this to Amazon Beanstalk. And so in order to do that, I have to generate a WAR file. If I actually go into the workspace right here under keeping score, and I look under the Walmart folder, no, it's actually a Target folder, there's no WAR file there. I need to generate the WAR file, and I can do that by saying, hey Maven, generate a WAR file for me. So run as a Maven install. I don't know if install is a great term, but that causes the code to be compiled, the test to run, and the project to be packaged. We initially said we wanted this as a WAR file, so it'll package it up as a WAR file. So as that runs and downloads of various files, we should be able to see eventually in this target folder here, a WAR file will appear. And there it is, keepingscore.war. Okay, I'd like to deploy that. So I'm going to come over to Amazon. I've already logged into Amazon. There's my Elastic Beanstalk. So to deploy that WAR file, all I have to do is say create application. I'll say what's the application name. I'll call it keeping score. It'll ask me how I want to deploy it. Well, we tested on Tomcat, so I may as well deploy on Tomcat. I think all these settings look good to me. Do we want the sample application or our own code? We want our own code, of course. So I'm going to click choose file, keeping score WAR. It'll upload the file. That'll just take a second. And then it says you want to configure some more options. I'll say, yeah, I'll configure a few more options. I just want a public IP address. So I'll edit the network and say I want a public IP address and throw it into that US East zone for all my Toronto and New York friends. Okay, I think that's about it. Now this is just going to run the program. Create app, and the environment will be created. This will just take a few minutes. Okay, and it looks like my application is now deployed. It does say that we've got a URL over here as well. Now, I'm going to click on this. It's actually not going to work because I don't have anything mapped to the default URL, so I'm not worried about that. White label error, but I will say /score, and look, all of a sudden I've got JSON back, and if I say increase wins, well, it starts increasing the wins. So I've actually got an application deployed, a microservice deployed to Elastic Beanstalk. Now some people might say it's not really a microservice unless it's in a Docker container, but we can always just do a couple of settings changes inside of Spring Source Tool Suite and we could implement that. So anyways, that looks like it's working well. The last thing is, how do we integrate that into our application? So I've got this little rock, paper, scissors application. There it is, Rochambeau. It plays. I'd like to have up at the top like that global score counter. I'm not doing this on a per user basis. It's just like the global score. So how would I do that? Well, here's the code for the rock, paper, scissors application. You can see if it's a tie, if it's a win, if it's a loss. I'd like to implement, I'm just going to do the if for the tie right now, or if for the win. So let's integrate, some kind of functionality that tells us what happens when a user wins. So I kind of cheated. I got some code here. I'm not really going to do a tutorial on how to actually code HTML. But you could do something like this: wins, losses, ties. I'll leave you to implement the losses and ties, but I'm going to do the wins. You can see right up here, if the client gesture is paper, it's a win. And I got a little code to implement there as well. Now I do need the URL. So I'm going to come back, grab the URL for the game. That's the URL there for increase wins. So when there's a win, we'll call this URL. We'll generate an AJAX request that'll send an XML HTTP request off the network. This will increase the wins and it will return to us in JSON format the score. We'll parse the JSON into a score object and then we'll update that div on the page named wins with the score. And all of this is going to happen anytime we have a win. So I'm going to paste that code in. See if I can format that just a little bit there. Does that look a little bit better? So now if there's a win, what we're going to do is we're going to call our RESTful web service, our microservice. We're going to increase the wins and it's going to give us the number of wins back in the response text. We'll parse that into the score and then we'll update that div named wins, which is right there. Oh, I'm gonna can't have the same ID over there. You got to update that a little bit. Okay, now in theory, once we win our first game, that number of wins should be updated. So I'll come back here, play the game, do a refresh, click paper, and notice it says the number of wins is 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. So we are now getting the functionality that we wanted. I think I may actually just change that to span. And then put a p tag in there. Just a little formatting here. But let's see if that looks any better. Okay, there we go. Every time we play, it increases. Now, if you want to follow along and do a little bit of work on your own, go ahead and implement the losses and ties. It shouldn't be that difficult. Let's see if I can do that myself. So after a tie, do all that, paste that in. Instead of increase wins, it's increase losses. I'm going to get element by ID losses. I think there's an opportunity here for us to factor this out into a common method, but we'll fight one battle at a time. And then this should be, that should be a tie, right? Increase ties and then ties. Okay, well in theory, this should work. I did that quickly, but let's go over here and refresh the page. Okay, it's kind of working. Now actually, I think I need to go in and update this so that I don't just do the ties, but every time I do it, I want to there we go. That makes a little bit more sense. Now I think it's really close to working. But the goal here isn't to polish off this application 100%. The idea is to demonstrate how we can actually integrate that in. And so what we've done is we've created a single page interface here. This single page interface is fairly dynamic. Uses AJAX to call a RESTful web service, theoretically a microservice that has been deployed to Amazon Elastic Beanstalk and developed using Spring Boot and Spring Boot APIs. And I think all of that is pretty cool.